Leonardo used to stare at a wall that had water stains on it. And just this sort of random drip thing on the wall, as he stared at it, basically meditating, he had insights.
He's the man who drew the helicopter and the battle tank 400 years before it was invented. Yeah.
Yes, and who calculated the effects of gravity. We only just discovered that. I only realized literally a couple of months ago that he had calculated how gravity worked 100 years before it was actually considered. So when you look at this kind of thing, what you see is that all of these people, whether they're scientists, whether they're artists, whether they're spiritual pilgrims or whatever, whether they're remote viewers, they all go through these steps. Now, you would think that they would be teaching this in school, but they don't, because you have to be willing to surrender your preconceptions, and that's very hard for people to do.
Welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. Luciano here as your host as usual. Want to remind the listener also as usual, please take the time to rate us. Whatever podcast platform you use, we're on all major ones, obviously, and share with your family and friends. It'd be great for your circle to know what you're listening to. And we would be more than flattered that you do that. Before we get on to the conversation here, also want to remind the listener, if you like what we're talking about, and if you like how we're talking about it and with whom we're talking about what we're talking about, feel free to go to our website. You can see all our past episodes, our library of conversations with people around the world, and also where you can donate. If you choose to go that way, we are a charity, a registered charity, and a not-for-profit. You can just go to behindgreatness.org, and you'll find where you can donate, as well as where you can listen to all of our other discussions. We're not going to read Stephan's bio because we did that in the last conversation last week, and we're going to insist the listener, if you haven't already listened to the first part of this conversation with Stephan, do that first before you listen to this one here. It will make much more sense. You will have lots more background and context. And there's some chronological events as well that were discussed that would make much more sense for you to have in your own mind when you listen to this one here. So if you haven't, press pause right now, download last week's, listen to that, and come back to where we are here. Stephan, welcome back.
A pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure for me too. What I didn't do two things actually at the beginning of the conversation that we had last week. Of course, you are many things, and you've done many things, continue to do many things. People call you, and you are scientist, futurist, experimentalist above all, what I'm understanding as well from our conversations, novelist, documentarian, filmmaker. You were also, and this is one thing that I didn't mention at all, we didn't touch upon at all, is you were also a speechwriter for various folks, including, I'm going to say this for the listener, a Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger, a Chief of Naval Operations, a couple of admirals, and as well as President of the United States, Richard Nixon. So throw that into the mix of the things that you've been doing. Well, quickly, how did you get to writing speeches for the president?
They asked me.
I love you, Stephan. This is amazing. Of course. Well, again, if you were listening to last week's, it would make sense that Stephan was asked to do this. And why did you stop doing it?
I left government in 1976. I think that's right. Because I went through Watergate and I knew most of the Watergate people. And I realized that I was not able to discern in all cases the good guys from the bad guys. a lack of discernment on my part. And also, I was approached 3 times by representatives in the military industrial complex, corporations, who offered me jobs paying 3 times what I was getting. I was a GS-15, so I was getting quite well paid. And I realized that the level of corruption between those two things, and I was not interested in power in that sense, and I was interested in studying consciousness, and so I decided to walk away from that career.
So people who were doing the same thing, quote unquote, studying consciousness, I would gather, especially in that era. So I was born in that era. Obviously, I didn't grow up in it. Would be affiliated with New Age movements, but you not so much. You were actually, as we discussed in the last conversation, you were actually experimenting live with people all around the world before even the U.S. government started to do it. So you were heavily involved in actually experimenting and running a lab to do this.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And what does that mean when you're, let's get into it. What does that mean when you're running a lab? Because you were one of, as we mentioned in the last one, you ran one of the 3 major labs in the US. The one was university based out of Princeton. The other one was CIA based, classified out of Stanford. So 2 questions, I guess. What does it mean when you are studying consciousness in a lab? And number 2, why did you stop in the 90s?
As you noted, I got started experimenting in 1968, doing what I then called distant viewing. I didn't know anybody. I knew I met 2 people who were in the consciousness community, I guess you'd call it that. Stan Krippner and Douglas Dean. And then I met a guy named Bernie Grad up in Canada. So I didn't really know anybody. You know, it wasn't like I came out of a university where I had studied it, and I got interested in this after spending almost 5 years reading all of the Edgar Cayce readings from start to finish in order. As far as I know, I'm the only person who's ever done it. And I read everything that had been published in a parapsychology journal from the very first journal up to that moment, as well as many, many books. Blavatsky, Steiner, Uspensky, Gurdjieff, Alice Bailey, all of those folk. And I got interested in doing experiments because I realized that there was something fundamentally wrong with the way we were approaching science and also society. And I wanted to figure out, most people got into this with the idea of doing experiments to prove whether what I would call non-local consciousness existed. And so they did experiments and had been doing it for, at that point when I got in, almost 50 years. And they were still talking about, is this stuff real? But I had, because of all the reading I had done, I didn't have any question it was real. What I wanted to know was, how does it work? What can you do to improve access to non-local information? And can you do anything of practical utility with it? What is it telling us about who we are as human beings? And what is it telling us about who we are in the matrix of consciousness? And so my work from the very beginning was focused on that. I don't like to be embarrassed. And so I had read all of the criticism of the research. And I thought, well, I'm only going to do triple blind. Triple blind means that at the time you do the experiment, there either is no answer, it only emerges afterwards, or nobody knows it. And I originally thought about astronomy. my original idea was to see if I could get what today we would call remote viewers to locate black holes. But as I got into that and really dug into it, I realized that the instruments that you would have to have access to were so expensive. There were so few of them. And when people got access, they had very complete schedules that the probability of my being able to do it to locate black holes was just non-existent, basically. So because I had a long interest in anthropology, I was one of the people that founded the Anthropology of Consciousness. There's a Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness, now called the Association for the Advancement for the Anthropology of Consciousness.
Sorry, what does that mean, Stephan? What is the anthropology of consciousness?
Well, the anthropology of consciousness. Anthropology is the study of human beings. And the anthropology of consciousness, I got interested in it because I had a number of experiences, and because through an odd sequence of experiences, I became involved with the Hopi Indians. And I met a number of Hopi shamans. And I had also spent time with the Bushmen in the Kalahari in South Africa, then Southwest Africa, now Namibia. And it had taught me there were a lot of ways to be a human being, but that there were certain constants as I looked across all the cultures of humanity, regardless of time and space, geography, culture, whatever. There were certain commonalities, and one of them was a belief in the idea of that there was some higher form of consciousness that was not essentially non-local in basis. So I thought, well, if I'm going to do experiments and I want them to be triple blind, and I can't do black holes, I started looking around, and in anthropology at that time, in archaeology, one of the big discussions going on in archaeology was where to look. Because most archaeological finds at that time, this is the 60s, were being made serendipitously. A farmer was plowing in his field, he found a tomb, a road crew was building a new highway, and they found a temple. And so there was a lot of discussion about it in the literature about where to look. And I thought, well, that's perfect, because if I can use remote viewing to, again, distant viewing, as I called it then, if I can use remote viewing to locate a previously unknown site, and not only locate it, but describe what I would find when I went there in great detail, then I had a pure, unimpeachable triple blind experiment, because everybody agreed they didn't know where it was. So there wasn't any argument about that. And I also decided that I would only go looking for things where I could also, either I or other people had used electronic remote surveying techniques to see if they could find something at the site that the remote viewers had picked, because that meant that there was no other way you could find it.
We listened to a couple of your stories about being in North Africa and finding two palaces and a tower. I keep calling
the Lighthouse of Pharaohs, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that thing. Yeah, only that. So yes, you brought us to the importance of the triple blind test, and you gave really good, stark examples of how you were literally ridiculed behind your back as you were finding these places in the desert. But I wanted you to please share the story about, and there's a reason why I ask you this too, because it's right at the end that I want to have this quick discussion about the bones of Alexander the Great, potentially the bones of Alexander the Great.
Oh, okay,
Do you
sure.
mind sharing that one?
Yeah, no, of course.
Please.
Well, anyway, before I had gone to Egypt, I had sent out a map of Alexandria, which I got from one of the defense agencies. And I remove all the names, and I remove the colors by turning it into a blueprint. So I took this map and I had it copied by technology to create blueprints. So everything was either gray or slightly bluish. And I did that because I had read in the literature. The thing you need to get about me, Luciano, is I am compulsively meticulous.
Yes.
And so one of the questions I asked was, well, if I had colors on the map, would people tempted to be drawn to the color that they particularly liked? So I went into the psychological literature and the neurological literature, and I found that, in fact, people had actually done experiments on that. And yes, people had a tendency to, when asked to locate something, they tended to pick the color that they particularly liked. So I thought, well, then I got to remove the colors. And I thought, well, if I'm going to give them a map and they may know something, maybe they read something somewhere, or somebody told them something about a particular name of site or named area, that they would be drawn to that. So I have to remove all the names. So I created this map that had no colors, just gray, bluish, well, a blueprint, didn't have the names. And I asked people to locate, among other things, the tomb of Alexander the Great. Because I had been approached by these two women historians, and that's what they were particularly interested in, was the tomb. And what I look for is where people pick the same place. That creates what I call a consensus zone. So I had a consensus zone, but the problem is the map, because it was scaled, if they drew a circle as big as a quarter, for instance, well, that might cover a number of blocks in downtown Alexandria. So that wasn't enough. That gave me a place to start, but it didn't give me enough detail to be able to do an excavation. So I got them to describe the site that they were talking about, what they picked. And there was one site that almost all of them picked. Not all of them, but almost all of them. And that was the Mosque of Nebi Daniel. The interesting thing about the Mosque of Nebi Daniel is that before it was a mosque, it was a church, because the Muslims didn't take over Alexandria until 641 AD. And before it was a church, it was some kind of temple. So this thing had been there for well over 1,000 years, and I got them to describe it. And then when I got to Alexandria, I brought two of my remote viewers with me, George McMullen, probably the best archaeological remote viewer there's ever been, and Hella Hamid, an extraordinarily gifted remote viewer, who was also a nationally known fine arts photographer. And I put them in a car and said, would you please locate this site you located on the map, without showing the map? And they would say, drive down here, turn left, turn right. And we got to, they guided me to, as it turned out, the Mosque of Nebi Daniel. Hella, for instance, had described in great detail something that was across the street from the Mosque of Nebi Daniel, this strange little, like an alleyway or a little, I don't know how to describe it. It was where some ruins were. And anyway, she had described it in detail before we went, and then had drawn me pictures of it. And then she led me right up to it. And across the street was the mosque. And so I then asked them to go into the mosque and around the immediate outside of the mosque. And they both located the same place. I went to the mullah who was the head of the mosque and asked him if I could do an excavation there. And I had to go to the Department of Archaeology in Cairo to get permission to do an excavation. And I had to get the Islamic community to agree. It was a whole process.
Mm-hmm.
And we started doing this dig, and I got the University of Alexandria, who wanted to be part of it and wanted basically to oversee me because they thought the whole thing was nonsense. They assigned a guy named Fauzi Fakhrani, who was an archaeologist, to oversee what I was doing. And we started an excavation, and everything that we found at the beginning of the excavation was exactly as described by the remote viewers when they were still back in the United States, and then added on to when George and Hella got to, were physically in Alexandria. But this is 1979. And as we were digging in Iran, in Tehran, if you remember, a group of young people took over the American embassy.
Yep.
And started the whole business with Iran. And the director of excavations came down in Cairo, came down to Alexandria. Cairo and Alex are the two biggest cities in the country. He came down and said, "You got to stop because of what's going on in Iran." And the Nebi Daniel Mosque was a Shiite mosque, and he said, "You know, there could be people who were upset about what you're doing, and we don't need to have a repeat of what's going on in Iran. So you're going to have to stop." Which was, I thought, quite depressing.
Sure.
And it happened the next day as I went around to talk to the man who was the head of the mosque. George was with me, George McMullen. And as we were driving away, I was thinking, well, that's the end of that. It's nothing going to happen. And George said to me, and I recorded it, it's on recording. One of the things I do is film all these experiments so that you can see them as they actually happen. And they're also witnessed by all kinds of people. So there's just no question about what happened in what order. That's all very important to me, that you establish unimpeachable chronology.
And the listener can access this. Sorry, Stephan. The listener can access this all on your website, Stephan Schwartz, right?
You can see the film in the website.
Okay.
Anyway, George said to me as we were driving away, I was feeling very depressed. And he said, "Well, don't feel bad. The bones aren't there anyway." I said, "What?" He said, "Oh, yeah, no, the bones are not there. That's the tomb, but that's not where the bones are." I said, "Really? Where are the bones?" And he said, "Well, when the Muslims took over the city, a group of monks from a monastery that's up in the desert outside of Cairo came down masquerading as merchants, and they had a bunch of donkeys, and they got the bones out of the ossuary at the mosque, or then the church,
mm-hmm.
and they a number of bones, and they put the bones in leather bags and tied them on the back of the donkeys, and took them back up to the monastery. That's where they are." I said, "Really? Well, that's fascinating, George. But I mean, even if I could find the monastery and they would let me, if they knew where the bones, and all that, how would I know which bones were which? This is before DNA. I said, how would I know which were Alexander's bones? He said, oh, it's simple. I said, yeah, how is it simple? He said, well, because after when Mark Antony was with Cleopatra, in order to establish his linkage to Alexander, he went into the Soma. That's what the tomb was called. And Ptolemy Philadelphus, who had been the head, a forebearer of Cleopatra's, he had taken the bones of Alexander that Ptolemy Soter had put in the tomb, and he put them in a glass coffin, which, by the way, is where Stalin got the idea to put the body of Lenin in a glass coffin in Moscow. Anyway, he said, so Anthony went in, and after the Christians took over, they didn't really maintain the because it wasn't important to them. And so Alexander, when he had gone in a century before, several centuries before, he took off his red war cape and had them open the crystal coffin, and he wrapped the body of Alexander, which was mummified, in this red war cape. And then when the Christians took over, after Cleopatra was gone, after the Christianity began,
yep,
water seeped into the glass coffin because it wasn't being maintained, and it stained the bones red. So what you're looking for are the red stained bones. I thought, oh, well, that's interesting.
That's a lot of detail.
What mosque? How would you know? I mean, what monastery up in? I mean, the whole thing. I didn't know. Anyway, about 2 weeks later, I got a call from NBC, and they said, "You have the only film crew in Egypt that knows how to film archaeological sites." And there's a monastery up out in the desert, just exactly as George had said, outside of Cairo, called the San Makarios, that's in an oasis called Wadi Natrun. And they think they found the bones of John the Baptist. So would you go up there and film them for us? And film whatever shoot a film for us. And send it to us. And I thought, well, okay. So we worked out a deal. And so I can't remember, it was either that weekend or the next weekend. We drove up to the Wadi Natrun, which is nowhere in the middle of this desert. Just, it's an oasis. And there was the monastery of San Makarios. And it looked like a fort. Looked like a castle sort of thing. And it only had one little door. So I went up to the door, and there was no phone because I'd tried to call earlier. And so I knocked on there's one little door. I knocked on the door, and it was opened by this brother of the monastery. And I said to him why I was there, and I wanted to film where they thought they had found the bones of John the Baptist. And he said, sure, come on in. And the film crew, we went in. And we went, he took us to inside of this sort of walled, like a castle. There was this big open space. And there were a number of buildings, chapels and things inside the walls. And he took me up to one, and he said, this is the chapel of John the Baptist. And we've always associated this with John the Baptist. And there was a crack that formed in the wall, and we were trying to repair the wall. And in the course of doing that work, we discovered there was a tomb. I said, really? And what did you find? And he said, well, there were the bones of about 14 people. I said, really? Where did you get the bones from? He said, oh, well, we got them from underneath the Mosque of Nebi Daniel. And I said, well, I mean, I don't understand. How does that associate with John the Baptist? And why would you go down there? And how did you get it? You know, what happened? And he said, well, when we realized that the Muslims were going to take over Alexandria, a group of brothers went down. This has got to be about 641. So, you know, a couple thousand years ago. And a bunch of brothers who they masqueraded as merchants, and they went down. They took their donkeys and they went down with some leather bags to get the bones out of the monastery or the church that was about to be made into a mosque. And I said, "How do you know any of this?" And he said, "Well, it's all written down. We have it in the library." And he took me over to the library and he opened up this ancient book and there was this story. And I said, well, okay, now, of course, my hair at this point is standing on end.
Of course.
I mean, really, it's hard. It's really standing on end. I said to him, well, is there anything unusual about any of the bones? And he said, well, yeah, no, bones of about 14 people. Well, there are a few of them are stained red. I said, let me get this straight. You and back, whatever it is, however many years it is, in around 641 AD, a group of your monks before that, you know, your forebears, masqueraded as merchants, went down with a bunch of donkeys and some leather bags and got the bones out from under what was then a church, out of the ossuary. And you put them in these leather bags and you brought them up and you put them in this chapel, but then you lost them because you didn't know where they were until you tried to repair this wall and that revealed the tomb. Do I have that right? He said, yeah, that's it. I said, well, can I see the bones? He said, sure. So we went back we left the library, went back to this chapel, and there was what looked like a wooden altar. Turned out it was a chest. And he he took everything off the chest. It was where the altar of the chapel was. And he opened it up and there was this big red bag. And he said, you can't film this because these are holy relics, but you can take a picture of the bag. So I said, okay. So they took a picture of the bag. And then we had to turn the cameras off and then he opened the bag and I looked inside and there were a bunch of bones, human bones, obviously. And there were several which had this kind of dusty, reddish brown color. This is before DNA, so there wasn't anything you could do with it. So I thought it was exactly what George had told me. I mean, down to little stories. So he had told me this, and so I thought, well, that's, okay, there's no way to prove it. But then a few years later, DNA was discovered, and the human genome was laid out. And anyway, Philip's of Macedonia's tomb was found, and his bones were found, and they did a DNA sample. So now I had a way to prove it. So I contacted the monks again at the monastery and the abbot of the monastery, Father John said, well, we understand what you want, but they could also be the bones of John the Baptist. So we're not going to let you do that because these are holy relics. And so there was no way to test it. And so about 20 years went on, and I tried again to see if they would let me do a DNA analysis.
I love your spirit.
And I went back, and they said no. But some younger monks said, after Father John is gone, come back and talk to us. We'll let you do it. And so I think the bones of Alexander the Great are to be found in the red bag in the temple chest of the chapel of John the Baptist in the monastery of San Makarios in Wadi Natrun. And I believe that in the future that will be proved.
If I did the math correctly, this is about 20 years ago where you reapproached and the young monks told you to come back.
Oh, no, the last time I reapproached was about 2014.
Okay. And that's when they told you this.
Yeah.
So, okay. So right now, there is one person holding back that potential information from the rest of the world. And
well, they don't see it that way.
Well, but that's what it is.
Well, yes, but they don't. I listen, I respect and understand their position. They believe they have the bones of John the Baptist. That's what Alexander is not important to them. The bones of John the Baptist are about as important as something could get.
So we talked about disillusionment, the word disillusionment with Gabor Mate. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Gabor Mate. But he's an MD who's written about trauma for many, many years. He's an author. We talked about disillusionment and how people's belief systems have them disappointed when they're disillusioned.
Well, I don't think they'd be disillusioned. I don't think that's the problem, Luciano.
Tell me.
I don't think the problem is that they'd be disillusioned. I think the problem is that because they don't know which bone is which bones are which, and they see the bones of John the Baptist as holy relics. What they're concerned about is the desecration of a holy relic. Now, the younger monks, I think, get the point and are willing to let it, because as I said to them, look, I'm not going to hurt the bones, so I'm going to take a little tiny sample and do this analysis, and I'll pay for it and everything, blah blah blah. But Father John, the abbot, I understand where he's coming from. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate their concern, and I'm just waiting. And if not me, someone after me will go there and take those red stained bones and take a little sample and compare the DNA analysis with the analysis of Philip of Macedonia and prove that those are the bones of Alexander.
Or disprove. What does it matter? As long
or
as
disprove, yes.
Right?
Although, given that everything else George told me was correct, I suspect that those are the bones.
Right. Again, this is about, for me, I infer here that belief systems sometimes get in the way. And when they don't get in the way, lots more knowledge and perhaps wisdom could be attained.
Well, that's just true in general. I mean, physicalist materialism, it's not that it's wrong, it's that it's inadequate.
Yes. Well, okay. So brief story. Just today, I learned about a paleontologist, and he's actually coming on the podcast. He's a very well-known paleontologist. I'm going to say obviously studies dinosaurs. And what he found is that there are many dinosaurs that had so many similarities, is that he figured out, even though they were named different names, he figured out that many of these dinosaurs that are named different names are actually the same dinosaur, but some are juvenile versions of others. And museums did not allow him to borrow or any of the bones or cut through to prove whether some of them are juvenile. So he founded his own museum and did his own tests. He says, I have my own museum. I can cut any bones I want. And he disproved the many scientists who had thought that these were different dinosaurs because they held on to the belief that it was important for them to name the dinosaur what they wanted to name them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just because you're a scientist doesn't mean that you're open-minded about anything. I mean, what's physical materialism, which has been the dominant worldview in science, dates back to the Council of Trent in 1545 to 1563, when the Roman Catholic Church had 25 meetings and issued this edict, and science was just beginning, Galileo and all that. And they said anything that has to do with spirit, read consciousness, that's our world. And we control that. And anything that has to do with the physical world, well, that's your world. And if you cross over to our world and we can catch you, we're going to torture you and kill you.
Mm-hmm.
The Inquisition. They were responding to the Protestant Reformation movement, which was beginning at that time, and also the beginning of science, which they feared because, there were cardinals that wouldn't even look through Galileo's telescope because they were afraid that they would lose power.
Yeah.
So, physical materialism has dominated scientific thought ever since, until the end of the 19th century, when psychology, anthropology, parapsychology all began, because people were beginning to recognize that consciousness was a part of the fundamental nature of reality. And we're still struggling with materialism. There are still a large number of scientists who don't believe that non-local consciousness exists. They won't look at the data. They just say it's impossible. So, their minds are closed to facts. And so that's why I say the problem with materialism is not that it's wrong, it's that it's inadequate. And Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, spells this out in great detail. He says normal science continues under a paradigm, and then anomalies begin to accumulate. And there is great resistance because of the anomalies. Mm-hmm. And finally, you get to a point where the anomalies simply overpower because there's so many of them. Or, as Planck said, science changes one funeral at a time.
Funeral at a time. Well, yeah, the problem with that, obviously, is that sometimes you'll have to wait generations or centuries before anything moves. And in that space of time, you have cultures that are developing and mature under, what did you say? Under the inadequacy of one belief system, so just materialism. And yes. So going to culture, you said something to me the last time we chatted. You said, this is wonderful. And I'm not sure if it's your quote or another. Culture is the result of individual choices. It's a kind of vote.
That's me.
Okay.
Culture is the result of individual choices. Culture, the reason that different cultures cook food in different ways, for instance, or watch different sports, is because of individual choice. And whenever you get 10% of any group who choose to make a certain kind of choice, they change in consciousness, then the rest of the group has to accommodate that, has to work out a way to accommodate that. I mean, I can give you lots of examples if you'd like, but yes, culture is the result of collective individual choice.
Let's take this segue and let's go into outer space, maybe literally. Um, I I listened to a few of your interviews, obviously, as you know, as I've told you, and there was an interview that you gave to Jeffrey Mishlove, who's a parapsychologist, has his own show, Thinking Aloud, and you guys were discussing for a little bit a non-human intelligence, extraterrestrial intelligence, and you said something very interesting. You said, oh, because you were asked, are they watching us or studying us? And I think this is what you said. So correct me if I'm wrong, because I wrote it, but it's been a couple of months. You said they're behaving like cultural anthropologists.
Yeah.
Explain, elaborate.
Exactly. Look, I mean, if you put aside all the movie ideas about extraterrestrials,
yep,
it's obvious that if they wanted to conquer us, that they could have done so. I mean, we wouldn't have, if you can travel through space like that, you probably have abilities, technological abilities that we wouldn't even be able to respond to.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is it that they're doing? And why is it becoming more and more prevalent that there are reports of UAP encounters, unidentified aerial phenomena? And the answer is because I think if you think about it, technological cultures get to a point where they either destroy themselves because of their technologies,
Which
nuclear war,
sounds pretty human, yeah.
Or they wake up to the idea that consciousness is fundamental and causal. And if they wake up to that, then they make different choices and develop different technologies and go a different direction. And I would propose to you that we are at that point. We're either going to choose to develop new technologies which do not pollute the earth, which support well-being, everything from microplastics to carbon energy, or we're going to kill ourselves. And I'd say right now it's about a 50-50 toss-up.
You are also remote viewing the future.
Yes.
You are doing this in a lab setting as well. How is that happening? But to bring us through that, elaborate a little bit. So I also want to talk about something else. But this is important.
When I left government in 1976, I had been not only my official government posts, but I had been appointed to the Secretary of Defense MIT discussion group on innovation technology in the future. And I was part of the Smithsonian group on the same subject. And I was doing work with the National Security Council. And I thought we were going to have a nuclear war. In fact, everybody who was a part of that world thought the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we almost did have a nuclear war. Had it not been for one lieutenant colonel in the Soviet military.
In the submarine, right?
No, he was the head of the ballistic missile stations in Russia. And something went wrong with their radars, and they believed that there were incoming American missiles. And so he was told to push the button, which would have resulted in a nuclear war, which would have
Right.
destroyed humanity. But he just didn't believe it was true. His instinct was that it wasn't true, and he wouldn't push the button. So they sent a group down to arrest him. And by the time they got there, they realized that it was a mistake, that there was something malfunctioning. And so it didn't happen. Anyway, I knew that. And I thought there was a very real probability that there would be another mistake or, whatever, or somebody would do it deliberately. I mean, look at Putin. And that there was a very real chance we were going to have a nuclear war and destroy ourselves. So at that point, I had a little daughter. And I thought, gee, I wonder what her world is going to be like. And so in 1978, I began asking people to remote view the year 2050 at the same date. So, if it was the 7th of May, I would say to you, Luciano, I want you to go forward in time to the 7th of May, 2050, and tell me what you see. And I did this all over the world with all kinds of people, scientists, just sort of folk, in Mexico, in Russia, in Germany, France, England, Ireland, Canada, Jamaica. I asked people these same questions. And one of the things that they told me was there wasn't a nuclear war. So I felt much better about that. And I said, oh, well, then the world, I assume, is much safer. And they said to me, oh, no, the world is much, much more dangerous. I said, really? Why? They said terrorism. Well, in 1978, when I was doing this, 79, the only terrorism that was really going on before the Iranian thing was the fight between the Protestants and the Catholics in Ireland.
Yeah, right.
Northern Ireland. So I didn't know what to do with that. And I said to them, well, then, tell me about what's the Soviet Union like?
Sorry, this group, is it a consensus with this group?
Yes. I asked 4,000 people, and what I'm telling you is the consensus view. Not everybody gets it.
Right.
Not everybody gets the same details. I do exactly the same thing. That's where I got the idea. I do exactly the same thing that I did when I was an investigative journalist, or that intelligence communities do in order to get intelligence, the CIA or whatever. You ask multiple people, and what you're looking for is two things. One is where they agree, and the other is what are called low a priori observations. That is, things which you don't expect. I mean, if I ask you to locate a ship, and one of the things that you tell me I'm going to find is an anchor, well, it's a ship. Of course there's an anchor. But if you told me the captain had a crystal amethyst chandelier hanging in his cabin, I don't expect to see that. So that's a low a priori. And then if I go there and it's there, well, that's what I mean.
Right.
So what I'm telling you, of these 4,000 people, the consensus was the Soviet Union had disappeared. And I went around to a friend of mine who was at that time the head of NSA, National Security Agency, and I said to him, do you know any reason at all that the Soviet Union would disappear? I mean, what? Aliens came and took it away? Or, I mean, well, how could it disappear? And he said, that's just nonsense. The Soviet Union is not going to disappear. We have this bipolar world, blah, blah. Where in the world did you get such an idea? So, of course, on Christmas Day in 1991, Soviet Union disappeared.
Mm.
And I asked them all kinds of questions. I mean, for instance, I asked them to tell me about healthcare because I have been concerned for 50 years with the fact that in the United States, we don't have healthcare. We have an illness profit system. Healthcare is just the mechanism that they deal with, but the idea is to make money. Mm-hmm. It's all about making money. It's not about well-being. So I've been interested in healthcare, as I say, for 50 years. So I said, well, tell me about healthcare. And they began telling me, this is 78, they began telling me about genetic engineering, which didn't exist. And I said, well, are people healthier? And they said, well, no, they're not. And also there are these pandemics. And I said, what do you mean by pandemics? I'm thinking Spanish flu, 1918, right? Mm-hmm. They said, well, there's going to be a series of them, but the first one will be a blood disease which crosses over from primates to humans in Africa, and it's going to spread around the world and kill millions of people. And I went to a friend of mine who was the deputy director of the National Institutes of Health, and I said to him, do you know anything about a pandemic that's going to come out of Africa that has the potential to kill millions of people? It crosses over from primates to humans. And he said, nonsense.
Sure.
Specifically, he said, I don't know what you're smoking. You ought to quit.
Well, it's 1978. Could have been smoking anything.
Yeah, exactly. So, but then, of course, 1981, AIDS emerges. It crosses over from primates to humans, and it eventually kills 35 million people. And then SARS and Ebola and H5N1 and now COVID. And then as I began to dive into it, I realized that what's causing this is that as the climate changes, the viruses and bacteria mutate to accommodate the new circumstances, and we don't have any resistance to these things. So I think this is going to be, COVID is not the last one. But they were correct, the remote viewers. And I asked them, they told me carbon energy had ended, the internal combustion engine no longer existed, which seemed at that time preposterous to me. Anyway, basically...
Even 2 years ago would have been almost preposterous.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Basically, what I have seen with the 2050 data is that, as is generally true in remote viewing projects of mine, I mean, this is true of the archaeology projects, criminology projects. I mean, we've solved murders, all kinds of things.
Oh yeah, we didn't even talk about that. Even the murder of the Queen's horse, Queen Elizabeth's horse. But
yes,
we won't go down that. Yeah, the Queen called you to help find that horse, but that's another story.
Well, not the Queen, but her solicitor did.
Oh, my apologies. Solicitor to the Queen of England. Okay. Yeah, sorry.
The Queen's lawyer called me.
Yeah, of course.
But in any case, what I see is that between 35 and 40% of the information cannot be evaluated. Not that it's wrong, but I can't evaluate it. If you told me as the plane was crashing, the pilot, all he could think about was his young children. Well, that may be true, but unless he left some kind of record, there's no way to know.
Sure.
So about 35% of the material you just can't evaluate. So it could be right, but you don't know. You can't prove it. Of the remaining percent that you see, between 75 and 85% of it is correct or partially correct, but operational. By that, I mean, if I said the man interviewing me with black hair in the gray T-shirt, that would be correct, except for the T-shirt, but it would still be operational.
Okay.
So I expect to see 75 to 85% of the material that I can evaluate be correct or partially correct, but operational. And typically about 81% of it is just correct, period. Um, anyway, so all of the things that they told me, the 2050s, most of them have either happened or are in the process of happening. I mean, things like, I didn't have any idea. I had never heard of climate change until 1991 when I read a research paper published in the American Scientist about a coring experiment up in the Arctic, which talked about climate change. It's the first time I'd ever really heard about it or thought about it. But at the time I was doing the 2050s, for instance, if I was in Los Angeles, where my lab was located then, and I said to somebody, I want you to go forward to 2050, where are you? And they said, I'm in Los Angeles. And I said, well, what's it like? And they would say things like, well, a lot of it's underwater. What do you mean it's underwater? Well, it's part of Santa Monica, Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach. It's underwater. Why? Well, I don't know. The sea has risen. And I went around to a friend of mine who was the chief climatologist for in the government and asked him, can you tell me why the seas would rise up to a point where parts of Santa Monica would be underwater? And he said, no, I cannot tell you that because it's not going to happen. But of course, it has happened. It's happening. Anyway, so I spent a long time doing the analysis of this data. And then in 2018, I decided to take another look. And I wanted to go a little further forward in time to 2060. And so I began asking people about that. And I've had a couple thousand people all around the world give me a description of 2060. One of the reasons I did that is I wanted to see the question that nobody's ever been able to answer is when a person precognitively describes the future, are they describing a fixed future or are they describing the highest probability at the moment you're asking the question? And I don't know the answer to that yet, but I'm working it out. And also, if you go too far into the future, you can't understand what they're saying. I mean, if I told you, for instance, if we had done this interview, well, it wouldn't be on Zoom, but if we had done an interview and I told you that you could wear something on your wrist that would allow you to communicate with anybody in the world, unless you were reading Dick Tracy comics, how would I possibly make sense of that?
Mm.
Anyway, so I'm doing 2060 now. I'm doing the analysis of the data. And what they're telling me, I'll give you the main headlines so far.
Sorry, this is data now coming in from 2018. So you asked this question 5 years ago.
Okay. Starting 5 years ago.
Starting 5 years ago. Okay.
I'm still asking it.
Huh. Some long questions.
Well, there are about 31 questions. I ask about 31 questions.
Okay.
Anyway, the biggest headline is that between 2040 and 2045, there's going to be something very dramatic that fundamentally changes American culture just at the most fundamental level. Now, when I started this and started the analysis, I thought this was a single thing. Aliens suddenly landed. No, I don't think that's what it is. I think now I'm further into the analysis. I think it's a confluence of a number of things. One, climate change. Two, the end of the internal combustion engine. Three, the schism that is occurring in the United States, which is tearing us into two countries. Mm-hmm. that air travel becomes much less frequent, much less used because of the pollution issues. People seem to live in smaller communities. They tend to grow produce collectively in these smaller communities. You can see these things happening. Healthcare has become universal birthright, single payer healthcare. That there has been 3 major migrations in the United States: away from the coasts, out of the Southwest, away from the coast because too much water, out of the Southwest because there's not enough water and the temperatures get too high, and out of the central states because of cataclysmic weather events like tornadoes. So it's a very different world that we're talking about in 2060. I'm thinking of writing another novel on this. But in any case, I'm just doing a book, a fact-based book on this. But I think that by 2040, which is just a few years from now, really,
it's nothing.
We're going to be a very different country. We may become a substantially different country after the 24 election, because the red-blue split is becoming so pronounced. Every day I do the Schwartz Report, www.schwartzreport.net, and I publish on this every single day, 7 days a week. And what I see is this incredible split. Guns, in Washington State, they've outlawed AR-15s. In Texas, anybody can walk around with a weapon, no training, no license, no nothing, concealed weapon. They've had almost 4,000 people killed. The abortion issue, the women, the right to control their own bodies. In Washington State, where I live, they're buying up enough mipristone to give it to women for years, no matter what happens in the courts. Whereas in state like Idaho, the only hospital in Sandy Point, Idaho, has stopped doing obstetrical gynecological care. So I don't know what women are going to do, but already, as I predicted, I see young women choosing not to come to colleges. So in the red states, what you're seeing is a degrading of the well-being of society, and in the blue states, you're seeing an increase in the well-being of society, and it's becoming very, very pronounced.
That's by 2040, 2045, you're seeing this.
Yeah. I think 24, depending on how the election of 24 comes out, we're going to see, if the Democrats take both houses and retain the presidency, there is hope. If the Republicans take over both houses and the presidency, we're going to go through an extremely bleak and just horrible time. And I mean, that sounds like a politically partisan statement, but it's not. I mean, that's just based. I am an experimentalist. I care about objectively verifiable information.
Well, you're writing speech for a Republican president.
So. Yeah, I mean, I don't Republican, Democrat, I don't care. What I care about is, are you fostering well-being or are you degrading well-being? That's it.
Quick shift here, because we're coming to the end of the hour. This is beyond fascinating. So I've never been so quiet. Actually, with you and Ray Hernandez, you have quieted me so much, just because I need to process this while you're sharing, and you've shared most of this already a second time with me. So a couple of things I want to ask before we go. I also listened to a TED Talk that you gave some years ago. And there you talked about 6 factors to creativity. We like to talk about creativity on this podcast as well, but not to belabor all of this, but there's something that you said. One of the factors is your number 3. So number 1 was mastercraft, 2, have a deep belief in a solution. And then number 3, you said surrender all preconceptions that what you're doing works.
Yes. Well, again, Luciano, it's just based on facts. It's all based on objectively verifiable information. I do not speculate. I do not philosophize. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not about anything other than objectively verifiable information. So, about number 3. When you look at what people tell you who are historically famous for doing something that is acknowledged historically to be innovative and creative, whether it's in science or the arts or as spiritual leaders, they all tell you the same thing. They had to give up their preconceptions and accept that this insight that they had is, in fact, the right way to go. Einstein says he's whiling away the afternoon in a canoe after he's been sick, and he suddenly sees how relativity works. And it defies everything he knows, but he instinctively knows it's correct. Brahms, Beethoven, Mozart, they all talk about, I move into this altered state of consciousness and I hear the music. Mm. And it may be something I've never heard before, or I don't even think could work. And yet when I write it down, it is. Jonas Salk told me, walking across the Salk Institute campus one time, I said, how in the world did you ever get to discover the vaccine to polio? And he said, in a dream. I had a dream, and it told me to go in a completely different direction, and I would solve the problem I was working on, and I did, and it did. Descartes says he has 3 dreams in Ulm, Germany in 1619, and that they changed the entire course of his life. And everything he thought he knew, he puts aside, and he has this insight. And that's why he becomes a historical figure.
Yeah, we don't like to celebrate these facts of humanity. We ignore, actually not celebrate, ignore them. We ignore them.
We don't, as I said, there's this 6-step process that these people all go through in order to attain these insights. And one of them is you have to surrender your preconceptions. Well, you have to be convinced. You have to be convinced that there is an answer, but you also have to be willing to surrender all of your preconceptions and let the data take you where it takes you.
There you go. Your number 4 is you must have a technique of inward lookingness.
Yes.
Yeah.
So meditation is the obvious one, that most one. But Leonardo used to stare at a wall that had water stains on it. And just this sort of random drip thing on the wall, as he stared at it, basically meditating, he had insights.
He's the man who drew the helicopter and the battle tank 400 years before it was invented. Yeah.
Yes, and calculated the effects of gravity. We only just discovered that. I only realized literally a couple of months ago that he had calculated how gravity worked 100 years before it was actually considered. So when you look at this kind of thing, what you see is that all of these people, whether they're scientists, whether they're artists, whether they're spiritual pilgrims or whatever, whether they're remote viewers, they all go through these steps. Now, you would think that they would be teaching this in school, but they don't, because you have to be willing to surrender your preconceptions, and that's very hard for people to do.
Now, because our school systems, our academic systems guide us to figuring out a problem set.
Yeah. And most scientists are more concerned with their status in their peer group than they are in being innovators.
That's the lesson you gave us there in the first recorded session we had last week.
Yeah, well, it's Thomas Kuhn.
Once your body passes away, where is Stephan, or how is Stephan?
Well, if you look at the data, what you see is that consciousness is causal and fundamental. That consciousness, you have a kind of eternal self. That's not you. It's what religion calls the soul. But there is this eternal self, and episodically, it chooses to incarnate a personality. And after you die physically, that personality becomes integrated in with the eternal self, becomes part of the database of the eternal self, as it were. And episodically, you will manifest another personality, and what will come across from those earlier incarnations is information. You're not going to be coming back. I'm not going to be coming back. But both of us will, at some future date after our physical death, manifest another personality who is a kind of aggregate of all the prior versions. And they are all struggling and working with coming to be aware of the idea that consciousness is causal and fundamental, and that it is primary.
What is greatness to you?
Greatness to me is innovation which produces greater well-being.
Stephan, again, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
And I'm gonna say something maybe sounding a little bit grandiose. And thank you for doing all the things you've been doing for the last 60 years. Because I have been attracted to your story because it's not a story that I find great, quote unquote, but it's one where I find it's like I'm following you, just exploring and just asking questions and not stopping. And that's something that I want to keep doing, that I know that I haven't done enough of, and that I want my kids to keep doing, because I think that is part of being.
Yeah, that's how it works.
Exactly how it works. And never stopping. You're 81 years young, Stephan, and let me tell you, man, the energy that you have, I want half of that. Thank you again.
I'm still at it. I'm still writing. I'm still doing all the things that I do, because people say to me, "Are you ever going to retire?" And well, what would I do?
From what? This should be the question. Retire from what?
I like what I'm doing.
Yeah, please don't. I'm going to continue to follow.
I've been doing this basically all my life. I've walked away from a whole series of careers where I could have made much more money. That's not what interests me. What interests me is understanding how consciousness works and what we can do to foster well-being.
Well, I promise you one thing is we're we're going to take a slice of the energy you brought here, and we're going to take it with us as we explore with our future guests. Because we like to do that, but these 2 hours we spent together has been a motivator. Thank you so much. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today? Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and share with your friends. And consider donating to help us produce more great conversations at behindgreatness.org/donate. Until next time.